It's The Law with attorneys Roger Cates and Walter McKee. It's The Law explores the great legal issues of our times. It's The Law explains the politics and controversies behind the law. It's The Law explains the impact on real people with a live audience. It's The Law shows you how the law affects your daily life. Watch It's the Law with Roger and Walter and be in the know.
Good evening. I'm Walt McKee from Lippman, Cates & McKee.
And I'm Roger Cates, and welcome to It's the Law. Tonight we'll be talking about distracted driving. With the advent of cell phones and pagers and texting, how are we dealing with that as a society, and what's the legislature doing? Walter, the last couple of years there's been a real flurry of activity, particularly in the legislature, on the whole subject of distracted driving, cell phones, texting, and the rest. What's been going on?
There have been a number of bills that have actually come through the legislature in the past several years, usually around the issue of cell phones and whether people are allowed to drive and use cell phones at the same time. Last year, in 2009, the legislature finally passed a bill, and that bill dealt with the issue of distracted driving. It wasn't limited just to cell phones, but what the law talked about was driving a motor vehicle and being distracted and causing a traffic infraction or an accident at the same time. That law went into effect in September of 2009. It's been on the books for a while, and I gather we'll talk tonight about whether it's being used at all in any significant way.
Right. You know, oftentimes, and this is another case, there's a particular event or a particular incident that brings it to the attention of Maine people, and this time was no different. Tonight we're going to talk about with Trooper Tim Marks about what that was, but our other guests tonight are Secretary of State Matt Dunlap. We do have Trooper Tim Marks. We have also from the Maine State Police Lieutenant Mark Scott, and someone who probably knows more about this subject than anyone, Coney High School senior Jake LaChance, who's going to give us the perspective of his generation. So, Trooper Marks, what happened that got you interested in this subject?
Well, a few years ago, I was working in the Gardner area in the toll booth, and a woman came up to the toll booth, and she, I looked in, and she had a laptop running a DVD, watching the Gilmore Girls, and I said, "Whoa, wait a minute, whoa, that's not good. You should be paying attention to your driving." We had a law on the books at the time you couldn't watch TV, and I just couldn't stretch that to write her the ticket, knowing that a good lawyer may represent her. And so I told him to not watch it, and then I submitted some legislation through the department, an idea, you know. It was the technology hadn't caught up with the law at that point. The technology had gone too quickly, and we hadn't addressed it at that point.
Okay, so let's talk about how far the technology, whether the law has caught up with the technology, and what happened with this law that Walter mentioned that was passed in September of 2009. First of all, the law describes distraction or distracted driving as the actually impairment or would reasonably be expected to impair the ability of the person to safely operate the vehicle. And that's the definition, and it's got to be something other than driving, which affects the ability of the person or might reasonably affect the ability of the person to operate a motor vehicle. Right. If that happens, then what happens?
Well, nothing happens unless you actually commit a traffic infraction while you're doing something that is distracted driving. So if you actually engage in a traffic infraction going over the center line, or if you get involved in an accident, then you could be ticketed. So this is a civil ticket only, not a crime, for the ticket for distracted driving. Now remember here too, it has to be paired with something else. So the mere act of engaging in distracted driving, texting while you're driving, talking on your cell phone while you're driving is not a ticketable offense in and of itself. It has to be paired with doing something that involves a traffic infraction or getting into an accident or driving to endanger.
Right. Well, let's talk with Secretary of State Matt Dunlap, whose office deals with all of these laws, and I know, Matt, you were involved in the legislative history of this thing. And we're talking about cell phones, we're talking about texting, but it's far broader than that, isn't it? I mean, turning around to yelling your kids in the back seat, telling them to be quiet, that could be distracting as well, right?
That's absolutely right. And you go back to the legislative history of this particular statute, we'd seen bills almost perpetually every 2 years, sometimes half a dozen bills or more, to prohibit the use of cell phones or prohibit text messaging. And actually law enforcement would come in and say, well, really the problem is less necessarily cell phones than it is the issue of distracted driving. People getting dressed, putting on makeup, eating, drinking, yelling at the kids, dealing with the dog that's running loose in the van or whatever. They always illustrate it as a much, much broader issue. So the legislature decided to tackle the broader issue. What is distracted driving, and how do you how do you get at that? And I think that this is probably going to be more of an educational tool down the road. This is very much a new law, and it's going to be very difficult to know when it should be enforced and when it should not be enforced, because distractions take a lot of different shapes and sizes. It's not like when they did the statute a few years ago that mandated the use of a turn signal. You know, they went 6 months giving people warnings. I got one time, you know, don't forget to use your turn signal, because that's black and white. You know when the turn signal is on and you know when the turn signal is not on. But what is distraction? Is looking out the window a distraction? Tuning the radio? You have the turnpike signs that say tune in to 1610 a.m. for information about the roadway. So distracted driving is something that causes a lot of crashes. There's no question about it. And this is just beginning an evolution of a very long road in terms of getting people to take more responsibility for their action behind the wheel.
Well, you two have to enforce the law, and how do you view it? Is this law, as it's drafted, too broad? Does it give you guidance about what you're supposed to do when you're actually out there on the road, Trooper?
It's hard because it's not tested yet. Legally, we're not really sure where we stand yet. I've been very reluctant. I've written 1 ticket so far, and a lot of the other troopers are. I mean, we don't want to write bad paper. We want to be able to convict somebody if we write the ticket. Accidents, that's really key for me. If it's somebody's caused an accident because they've been distracted, then that's a ticket. But
how do you know that? I mean, unless you see the accident happen.
I had one just yesterday. A gentleman hit a Jersey barrier, and all by himself, nothing around. And I said, "What happened?" He was very up front. He goes, "I was texting." He goes, "I'm glad I didn't hit it any harder."
Lieutenant, too broad, not particular enough, too inclusive? How do you look at it?
I think it's actually a great place to start. If we take a look at some of the national statistics that are available and look at distracted driving as a whole, the percentages vary anywhere from 1% to 8% of distracted driving accidents are from cell phone use. But about 40% of the accidents are as a result of distracted driving in general terms. So it really was a good place to start, to take a look at the behavior that causes a certain result, which is not being able to maintain control of a vehicle, instead of looking at one particular specific act, like banning the use of cell phones or texting while they're operating a motor vehicle. So I do think that it's a good place to start. The law may very well need to be refreshed over time, but I think it gives us something to start to work with, and it certainly shows that there's been a considerable concern within the state, within representatives and the legislatures here.
Thanks. Jake LaChance, this new law has been in effect since basically the beginning of the school year. Something you and your contemporaries are talking about. The people have views on this in the high school community. What's the legislature getting involved with that for? Or are they saying it's about time, or what's the reaction?
I think it's a bit early to tell overall. Some kids talk about it. It's more enforced by their parents, not really by, I would say, their peers. But I'd say there's a wide spectrum as far as what teens think about if they should be doing it themselves. As far as, I mean, I've talked to some of my friends. Some of them don't use their phones at all. Some of them know it's wrong, but they still do it anyway. So I think, like Lieutenant said before, it's a good start, but it still needs a little time to kind of hit the teens.